Hi, welcome back to this new episode of IR Strikes Back. So today we're joined by Kimberly.
Hello, my name is Kimberly. I'm currently a master's student at Université de Montréal. I specialized in defense and security in the Baltic region, more particularly for Kaliningrad.
So thank you for joining us. As you can see, I do not have a co-host. She abandoned me. So I'm alone with our guest. So thank you, Lawrence. Today, we're talking about a movie that was filmed here at the University of Montreal in 2016. We're talking today about The Arrival. It's a film that was made by Denis Villeneuve, so we're going to decipher this with our wonderful guest.
For me, Arrival was really special because it was kind of breaking the code of traditional science fiction movies. Usually it's about war, invasion, or something else, but in this case it's about language and how it shapes cooperation and how different countries, how they react to it, basically. Protagonist, Louise, she's a linguistic who's tasked with producing an entirely unknown language. The real issue is about preventing a global war caused by miscommunication.
And about that, at the beginning of the movie, we can see that she enters the university, which is supposed to be a prestigious linguistic center, which is in fact the University of Montreal. And we see that her class is basically empty. And that most of the students are outside watching the TV, the news about these strange new creatures that arrive on Earth. So it made me think about the Twin Towers incident. Because at the time, my mother was a teacher, and literally this scene was the same scene as when she was teaching her class. She asked her students, "What is happening?" And they answered, "Oh, the Twin Towers were attacked." So it really echoes for me to this incident and how it shake the US and even I would say the world, because there was a small financial crisis upon seeing this incident because people were panicking. And it's a bit the same situation that is happening because throughout the movie, we can see that there's a curfew that is imposed like in the pandemic, but we cannot say that it refers to that since it hadn't happened yet. But still, the financial crisis is very akin the Twin Towers incident. It's really interesting, as Kim was saying, because all of this is about stories. It's about how we talk about events that happen in the past and currently.
From action to interpretation is precisely where the film aligns so powerfully with international relations. Because global politics, especially in moments of crisis, it's not just what states do that matters, it's how their actions are read, framed, and narrated by others.
Yes, and in international relations, there are several theories that can help us read these kind of action from the states. But today, as we mentioned, things are changing. International politics is being reshaped. And due to this, international relation theories cannot be taken as a standalone to analyze the action and the reactions of the states and other non-governmental actors. We need to combine different perspectives to be able to read properly their action and the reason behind it, which is why, for us, we perceive this movie as a mix of constructivism and realism. So in international relations, to do a short story, realism is not in the common sense. It's more about saying that each international actors, understood in the States mainly, are fundamentally thinking about their own interests, and they'll do anything, even if they're cooperating with another state for now, to achieve their own goals. It's their priorities that comes first.
So If we continue the part of language as power, there's a line in the film that sums up its core. Language is the first weapon drawn in a conflict. And I think in Arrival, the mistranslation of a word weapon, which is actually tool, when we see later in the movie, it nearly sparks a global panic. The moment shows us that language is never neutral. It's always shaped by context, fear, history, and by the assumptions that we bring to it, to just a certain word.
Yes, exactly. And in this movie, the way that like the allies of the US are represented is very interesting, because to the contrary to G20 that we analyzed with Lawrence, we see that the main ally in Asia for the US is Japan. And why we know this is that one of the sites where the spaceships landed, it's in Hokkaido. Hokkaido is a northern region of Japan. But we do not mention South Korea to the contrary of the G20. So we see that in 2016, the main ally of the US in the Asia-Pacific region is Japan, and Korea is nowhere to be seen. And regarding that, another interesting point is that we picture the opponent of the US and their allies as being Russia.
So in this situation with Russia, it's a striking parallel. Over the past decade, we've seen a growing gap between what Russia says, what it is doing, and how it is perceived, especially by the West. For example, Russian officials might describe certain military buildups as defensive, while NATO countries interpret the same movement as acts of aggression. It's linguistic and conceptual. Just like in Arrival, when there's no shared grammar, fear fills the silence.
And I think it's a symptom about the bilateral relations of the US with Russia and China.
What is shown in the movie is actually a representation of the tension between the US and Russia, because the movie was made in 2016 and the invasion happened in 2014. The main issue is that Russia just decides, oh, here, we're going to take a part of Ukraine. It used to belong to us. And the US doesn't accept it because they're like, oh, well, you're going over international rights. You're not supposed to invade or cause war. After the annexion of Crimea, Russia is being kicked out of the G8, not because they're not a global power. It's because the US, they don't want to tolerate their presence anymore by, kicking them out of the G8.
As for China, what is interesting with the portrayal of Russia compared to China is that actually, spoiler alert, assume the consequences of clicking on this movie. You should have seen it already because it's Denis Villeneuve that did it. So you have to. It's duty. So it's interesting to compare the representation of Russia compared to China in this movie. Because in this movie, we straight out portray Russia as being some kind of bad guy, which cannot be redeemed. There's no part in the movie that indicates any possibility that Russia might cooperate. Person that Louise called at the end against the orders of US military is General Shang. So the general of the Chinese army. Because he's the one that holds influence, real influence in this movie, and is having a different opinion compared to the US regarding the alliance and regarding their use of the word weapon. So it's interesting that the main power behind this other faction that is opposing the US is China. But the thing is that at the end, Louis calls the general and tells him the last words that his wife told him. And it's what makes China stops their action to attack the alliance. It shows that despite portraying China as being the bad guy at first, at the end, they're allies with whom they had just a misunderstanding. And that's very interesting, knowing that in 2016, it was the election of Donald Trump. And that in 2018, around 2018, the US started a commercial war with China. So just at the time of the election of Trump, there was not such an anti-Chinese sentiment. It came after, because the US considers that China, that is playing by international rules, that has influence, because in the movie we see that China is portrayed as being really a leader of another faction that is challenging the position of the US. And it's very representative because at the time, 2016, China's economy was doing rather well, I would say, and they started to hold more influence in the United Nations organizations. For example, at the WHO and at the International Organization for Agriculture. This movie really represents the current international politics, actually, at the time.
As we can see, you mentioned China, but of course, Russia was already out of the question.
Compared to China, which is considered still an ally that we just need to communicate better with him. It's more like that. It's more about communication with China, an issue, than really portraying, in fact, China as a real enemy. It's just portrayed as just a misunderstanding between the US and China. Internationally, at that time, China has a really good reputation in international politics. It had really good relations with the European Union and even bilateral relations with France, the UK, most of our European countries, and even with Canada. I just want to remind you that in the renegotiation of the free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the US added a clause, Chapter 32, that states that if any party has any sorts of free trade agreements with China, the free trade agreement between the three can be voided. That says a lot about the relations between China and Canada at the time. And it states that the US was scared that Mexico and Canada might lean more toward China and develop more important commercial relation with China than with the US. It's also interesting to note that Louis references to the media, and actually there's a lot of representation of how the government is criticized and how the media is criticized, the traditional media, because at first when the aliens arrived, we see a moment is in call with her mother, and her mother worries about the aliens because she watches some media, traditional news
that are maybe mainly propaganda. We don't know what's happening. People are they're panicking, so they're saying everything that's coming out of their minds. They're not saying what is actually happening. So in that sense, Louise is kind of warning her mother against listening to those news, because there might not be a real interpretation of what's happening on the place.
At that time, there's already some kind of looming mistrust about traditional media, about certain TV news, shows. There's a distrust in certain medias. It's the beginning.
So there's three forms of propaganda: black, gray, and white. In this movie, what we see is the gray propaganda, because we don't know who it's actually coming from. We don't know if their intent is bad. Is it good? We have no idea.
It's clear that they criticize the government because government have different level of security clearance that you can get. And if you do not get it, if you're outside of this security architecture, you do not have informations. And in this situation, where everyone is panicking. Everyone is questioning everything and people are panicking because the government doesn't want to spread what is happening regarding these aliens. So people are starting to question even more governments that are already showing cracks regarding healthcare, about supposedly the US military. So there's a lot of critics, and we see that the soldiers at the top secret camp near one of the space vessel is listening to some kind of, I would say, vloggers at the time, states that he knows what is best and that the American government is not good at dealing with the crisis. And we see many scenes where they listen to that kind of beginning of disinformation, propaganda, as Kim was saying. But actually in international relations, sadly, you have to pass a security clearance to get real information that helps you write political notes to inform, for example, the Prime Minister about a current crisis. But these documents sometimes have sensible information, so you have to show that you're worthy of trust, because it's not information that should be spread in the public, because sometimes this information was not obtained very legally or we're still confirming certain aspect. So we mentioned in the movie the SSBI security clearance of Louise, and it was mentioned by the CIA guy that comes to recruit her, states that she still have a valid security clearance, which would make her perfect for deciphering this new language. And it's very common for the military or any defense infrastructure to require outside help, because this kind of big infrastructure are not always able to have indoor, let's say, specialists to respond to a special crisis like is the case here. So if we fast forward to the moment that every side deciphered that the aliens mentioned the word weapon, and we see that now we're shifting, and it's where the realism theory of international relations comes handy. Because from the beginning, it was more about perception, because we mentioned a lot the different countries found ways to communicate with the aliens, and it represented their different perception of reality about the crisis. But from the moment that the word weapons is mentioned, now we fall to another sphere. And now we see that the cooperation that we had seen among all the sides where there was spatial vessels is gone, because everyone realized that now it's not about meeting a new civilization, it's about preparing to deal with this imminent national threat that is on their respective territories. From that point, we see military from different countries shutting down the comms and taking the control, because before they were behind the specialists, the linguistic specialists, waiting for them to decipher the language. And now they're taking actions. They're not spectators anymore.
With each country acting on its own, it's making everything collapse, basically. Because all 12 were communicating, they were sharing notes about, oh, this is going on. But then the word weapon is mentioned, which is actually the word tool. And it's the name of the language of the aliens. Painfully familiar. We've seen the same pattern during the pandemic. States turned inward, hoarding vaccines, destroying data. They're not sure who to trust.
Even if China shows that they're becoming more hostile against these aliens, they still ask for a meeting at the UN, which is really surprising because it's something that we imagine the US would do normally. They have influence on developing countries, for example, through the BRICS. So as we mentioned in G20, this group of developing countries which do not have a place at the G7 and that decided to gather together to discuss matters that were important to them and to counter Western influence, basically. So they call for a meeting, but they still argue that everyone should have a strong position against the aliens and prepare their weapons to better face the threat.
In the film, Russia is actually one of the first countries to cut off communication while they're into the aliens as a threat rather than a mystery. And I find that mirrors a broader trend, Russia's gradual disengagement from multilateral frameworks. This results in both the film and real life is the same. Once communication fails, fear becomes the policy, basically. And from there, escalation becomes almost inevitable.
One of the fundamentals of diplomacy and peace is to always keep the communications open. Because from the moment that you close communication in this movie, it's very clear that they're cut off, like very visually, communications. Then it's war. From the moment that you cut contact, then the heads of the leaders starts to spin around and to imagine the worst. At that point, we start to see an escalation because no one talks anymore. No one wants to find a solution, a peaceful one. No one knows what the other is doing, so it leads often to a security dilemma. The principle of a security dilemma is basically you see your neighbor that has a big gun. Oh, you're scared, so to protect yourself, you buy a big gun too. But then your neighbor sees that and says, oh my God, I need to protect myself. So he buys a bigger gun and it goes on. So basically, that's what we're seeing. From the moment that Russia cuts the communication, everyone cuts and everyone is readying their weapons and everyone is panicking. Basically, there's no one that is trying to find a solution in there. Everyone's just doing what we could consider a textbook escalation of a conflict according to realism. We see that the US is trying to keep the power in there because they wanted to be the leader of a faction which was more friendly to aliens, but still continue to talk to China and Russia. But it's also mentioned that when whatever China does, 4 other countries does the same. It's literally that. We see a very tangible struggle between the old hegemon and the new one. But as we mentioned earlier, at the end, it portrays more and truthfully China as an ally of the US with whom they just had a miscommunication.
What I find is really interesting is that meanwhile all this chaos is going on, Louise is still trying to find a solution. She's still trying to decode the language, find what's happening, because she wants to stop this war, well, we would say this global war or intergalactical war from starting. So it's really fascinating that the countries, so on the more macro level, everything is shutting down. But on the macro, if we just focus on Louise, she's still trying to find a solution to what is happening.
And the solution is reopening the communications with China. And from the moment that she calls the Chinese generals and talks with him basically in Chinese, it settles itself. And that, I believe, should be a lesson for the upcoming years. This movie shows that it's necessary to take the time to discuss. It might be more difficult with the international context nowadays or even in our society, but one gesture of kindness can lead to greatness. And I think that was also the moral of Thunderbolts. So I would invite you to watch it over there. And if you like this episode, don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And if you are interested into being a guest on our podcast, on our Instagram, there's a Google form where you could register and pitch us your idea, and we will be glad to have you. So have a great day, guys, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.